Hello, everyone. I'm James Millward from Georgetown University, and welcome to Georgetown, virtually at least, and to our webinar on China's Xinjiang region, How Should the International Community Respond? This webinar is sponsored by the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and the Asia Studies program at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. We're at a curious time in regard to the crisis in Xinjiang and East Turkestan right now. Revelations and investigations over the past few years have shown the extent of surveillance, controls on daily life, internments, and imprisonments of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Hui, and other non-Han people in the region. And we've begun to understand the nature of the state-led assault against Uyghur language, architecture, other aspects of culture, and the Uyghur national identity, including zealous limits on births in southern Xinjiang. None of this has changed, and many of our colleagues, friends, and family members remain disappeared. Yet large numbers of people have apparently left the camps, either sentenced to long prison sentences or graduated to work as transfer laborers. Large numbers of people who weren't in the camps have been channeled into factory work as well, often far from their homes. US and European governments have focused on the forced labor issue in developing sanctions on individuals and on companies in and associated with Xinjiang. The US Uyghur, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has become law in the United States, and in June will come into force, requiring companies importing anything from Xinjiang to prove that it was not produced with forced labor. And this could have significant effects on apparel and also solar industries worldwide. Yet at the same time, the world's attention and that of the US government has shifted to the atrocities in Ukraine. A new first-party secretary has been installed in charge of Xinjiang, Ma Xingrui, a man with obvious economic and pro-business credentials from previous posts in Shenzhen and Guangdong. And this is in contrast, of course, to the former Xinjiang headman, Chen Quanguo, who was kind of an enforcer with a background in Tibet. And while the parlous state of US-China relations remains in the news, the Xinjiang issue now is but one of several challenging that relationship, including Taiwan, and of course, the friction point regarding the PRC's ambiguous position vis-a-vis Russia. And of course, renewed concerns about COVID, including the severe lockdown in Shanghai and maybe now in Beijing, will have major effects on Chinese industry and global supply chains, to the extent that Xinjiang sanctions may become or may seem moot. And yet at this very moment, a UN team is now quarantining, I believe, in Guangdong in preparation for an inspection visit regarding human rights in the Uyghur region. So at this somewhat ambiguous period then, I'm very pleased to have with us a panel of experts with a variety of perspectives who can give us some guidance about how nations and also individuals should think about and respond to the ongoing policies in Xinjiang and in regard to Xinjiang's non-Han peoples. And we're going to begin with Professor Timothy Gross, who's a professor of China Studies at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, with expertise in ethnicity, ethnic policy in China, and minority education. Tim's current research is focused on the Uyghur population, ethnic and religious policies in contemporary China, and Islamic piety in Xinjiang. He's also a member of the team running the Xinjiang Documentation Project, a tremendous resource housed at the University of British Columbia. Follow him on Twitter for an interesting collection of documents and photos about Xinjiang, Tibet. And he always provides the full documentation for those things. And so I'll now turn it over to you for a few minutes, Tim.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted and honored to be part of the panel. And I've been asked today to talk about the crisis ongoing in the Uyghur homeland and maybe put it in kind of a broader national perspective in how these policies compared to other ethnic policies that have been enforced in Tibetan and in Hui areas. And so real quickly, I'm going to share a couple of slides just as perhaps talking points that can move the conversation forward. So I assume everyone sees my slides now? Okay. I think there is a new phase of ethnic policy that began in 2016, maybe a little bit prior to 2016, with Xi Jinping announcing the so-called Sinicization of religion. And I think if we look at the Chinese Communist Party's broader policies on religious policy, they provide important insight on broader ethnic policy in the People's Republic of China. Keeping in mind that the People's Republic of China is vast and diverse, and you have several levels of officials, kind of implementing and interpreting law, and oftentimes they're are seizing upon the so-called Tifa, these kind of set phrases, and they're using these as guides to implement their work. But still, we see some very, I think, visual and arresting images that may reflect broader policy, broader ethnic policy in these regions, and oftentimes the most vivid of these imageries, of this imagery is destruction, right? We have destruction of religious buildings. And as I said, I think that this provides important insight into broader ethnic policy. And I always like to remind individuals that according to the Chinese Constitution, citizens of China have the freedom to believe in religion, but such freedoms aren't extended to belief. In fact, only quote unquote normal religious activities are protected by the Constitution. So this gives a lot of flexibility to officials in various regions to interpret and decide for themselves what can be considered as normal religious activities. And certainly in Xinjiang, I think we see an extreme case where most forms of religious activity have been deemed by officials as abnormal and therefore illegal. So this photo is from a religious building in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region that I took in 2014. So these posters were hung outside every religious site in the region during the early and mid 2010s. And these were extended to so-called abnormal dress. So again, we see this broadening of what is considered abnormal and therefore illegal religious activities to the extent that pious appearances were deemed as extremists and therefore banned. And these policies were extended even further and intensified with the creation of the so-called re-education centers. And many of the people that found themselves detained in these facilities were detained because, in fact, they had maintained a pious lifestyle, and they were expressions of their religiosity, and those were the reasons for their extrajudicial incarcerations. And in the meantime, there are broadening restrictions on who can pray. And so essentially, if you have a family member or yourself has any connection with the government, or if you have a child in school, you're no longer permitted to pray inside a mosque. And there are several mechanisms to make sure that those policies are imposed uniformly. And then, so not only are these policies directed towards religious spaces, but then the homes, and more specifically those areas in the homes that blur the divides between sacred and profane, they're being removed en masse. More specifically, the supa, or the raised platform, oftentimes the center of family activity, but also the site of many important life cycle rituals that have religious underpinnings to them. These platforms have been removed from houses, and of course, government officials have infiltrated the homes in the so-called homestay program. So now, the one last area in Uyghur communities that in fact, was kind of insulated from the government's watchful eye has been pried open and is now a site for government intervention. We see some of these similar policies being implemented in Hui communities, but certainly not to the extent. Most of the types of repressive policies for Hui communities vis-a-vis or within the context of religion has to do with the destruction of certain architectural elements of mosques, more specifically domes and minaret, with maybe the most widely covered news piece being in Xining in the Dongguan Mosque, which is one of the largest in China, and its domes and minarets were removed in 2021. But we don't see the type of invasive policies that we see in Xinjiang. Yet all of these policies, the removal of mosques, domes, and we have curbing on some Arabic schools in Hui communities. And of course, we have the extreme policies in the Uyghur homeland. They're being fueled by an Islamophobia that is, I think, has intensified in China. And curiously, this type of speech is permitted to a certain degree on Chinese social media, which is supposed to be heavily censored, especially a type of speech that is detrimental or harmful for other ethnic groups. The Tibetan persecution is not as visible, and it's mostly isolated to monastic communities, keeping in mind that monastic communities provide that spiritual link between the secular and the faith, or the secular and religious communities, and with the Sangha, or the community of monks and nuns, with this transmission, this chain going all the way back to the historical Buddha. So a lot of the persecution and repression is occurring within the monastery, with controls on reincarnations, the documentation and records of reincarnations, the type of curriculum that's being allowed in the monasteries, and quotas being placed on monks and nuns. And so, on the surface, and just doing a kind of a cursory glance at Tibetan Buddhist communities in the People's Republic of China, especially in places like Amdo and Kham, it appears as if it's thriving, though one of the reasons it has this appearance is because of cultural, of sharing and a legacy of cultural continuity between Tibetan and Chinese Buddhists, and a robust tourism industry, which attracts mainly Han domestic tourism, or Han domestic tourists, and more specifically those who want to visit these monasteries and see monks and nuns in their religious settings. And so I'm just going to end with this very, very kind of, it's initial thoughts about why we may be seeing these different types of religious policies being enacted in different ethnic communities in China. And this is inspired by Susan McCarthy's book, Communist Multiculturalism, in which she sets up a similar chart. And it appears to me that we see these different types of implementation and different degrees of severity, depending on whether or not the religion itself is viewed by officials as part of quote unquote Chinese historical culture, or whether it's seen as foreign, and whether or not this religion is fused with an ethno-national identity, or if it's just part of a minzu, or is it just a cultural element. And so we can see that the Uighurs, having this fusion of a ethno-national identity with religion, and religion being Islam, so being foreign, that the repression seems to be most severe, whereas Tibetans kind of teeter on that line, because the religion has these ties with, with ties with Imperial China, yet it's fused with an ethno-national identity. So the repression, it tends to be a little less severe, whereas Hui, we have a foreign, quote unquote, foreign religion, but in many instances, this religion isn't part of a broader ethno-national identity, calls for greater autonomy or independence Therefore, they tend to have the least severe of the repression. So I'm right there. I think I'm already over time. Thank you very much.
Still muted.
You muted.
Thank you, Tim, for that. I wanted to mention to the audience that we will be taking questions, so please use the question and answer function, and we will gather them and then deliver them to the panelists later on. Okay, now up next, we have Maya Wong. Maya Wong is a senior China researcher in the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. She has researched and written extensively on the use of torture, arbitrary detention, human rights defenders, civil society, disability rights, and women's rights in China. She's also an expert on human rights in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Her original research on China's use of technology for mass surveillance, including the use of biometrics, artificial intelligence, and big data, helped to galvanize international attention on those developments. And it's still worth reading if you've never read that report. It's really worth going back to look. Particularly the technological stuff remains extremely current right now and extremely important right now. And so I'll turn this over to you now, Maya.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel, and good morning and evening, wherever you are. I hope you can hear me. I will just start by, I think Jim took many of my talking points. I think that's, but I will start by talking about what have been kind of the rights violations that are taking place in Xinjiang. I would start by saying that, you know, Xinjiang is a region in China that has for a long time been, I guess, traditionally be more kind of repressive compared to the rest of China. And as China itself becomes more repressive under President Xi Jinping, who has been in power since 2013, Xinjiang's repression deepened even further compared to, you know, before. Under the Strike Hard campaign, which started in 2014, some of the repression have been ratcheted up, like Tim had described. But the current phase of repression in Xinjiang really started in 2017. When we started to see up to essentially around 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, including ethnic Kazakhs who live in the region of Xinjiang, being put in various forms of detention and imprisonment. Tim talked about these political education camps, which I want to emphasize are completely unlawful. Despite what the Chinese government says, people do not have lawyers. They do go through courts, and then they are essentially taken to these facilities where they're held indefinitely and subjected to indoctrination. They're not allowed to speak their own language. They're tortured if they do speak in Uyghur or Kazakh, and if they pray or if they have any kind of religious expressions, they are punished in these facilities. Now, there are a lot of people also are held in prisons, which are, facilities that are prescribed in law, but nonetheless, they are held in, they're imprisoned for long periods of time for quote unquote crimes that also have very little basis essentially in kind of Chinese law. People are being imprisoned for, having attended a neighbor's prayer meeting or prayer because the neighbor had died 6 years ago. These kind of behavior that people did many years ago are now being used as evidence of their crime, in which they are then given long prison sentences for. We're talking about an average sentence of 12.5 years in prison for these kind of lawful behavior. And I think both the use of political education camps and these long imprisonment are shocking by, by many standards, even I think China's at the time in 2017. So the rights abuses in Xinjiang are not limited to what has been happening in detention facilities or prisons, but also outside of these facilities. The use of mass surveillance, the forced collection of biometrics, everything from DNA to obviously, people's facial images, but also their movements through tracking through their cell phones. People are required to go through checkpoints continuously every day, even just going to work, where these checkpoints in turn form networks of sensory systems that then track their movements, relationships, and whether or not there are irregularities in these behaviors. For example, if you use WhatsApp instead of WeChat in Xinjiang, that is reason enough for police to interrogate you and then to be sent on to these political education camps and prisons. Other kinds of violations include the Becoming Family program that Tim also mentioned, where government officials stay in Muslim families with the requirement is about 5 days every 2 months at least, where these are in part, they're called homestays. That sounds almost like some kind of vacation, but in fact, these are part surveillance roles and in part indoctrination roles, where Uyghurs are terrified when these carters come into their homes, invading their homes essentially, where their behaviors can be reported, and if they don't comply with that kind of whatever instructions that the carters give them in their homes. So these are some of the examples of the violations that take place in Xinjiang, which range from, obviously how people practice freedom of religion, freedom of expression, to, the use of arbitrary detention. Human Rights Watch has determined what's happening in Xinjiang to be crimes against humanity. And these are some of the gravest violations of international human rights standards and laws. And we have, of course, given a lot of recommendations to the Chinese governments, to the UN, and to international community to hold the Chinese government accountable. Nonetheless, I think that the Chinese government has suffered quite a lot of international criticism for its behavior, for its crimes in Xinjiang. And I think it has responded to a large extent by essentially ramping up its propaganda about the region, to say that everything is fine in the region and so on. But also, I think there have been some people being released from political education camps, but the restrictions in the region, like I said, outside of the detention facilities remain very severe. The use of mass surveillance remain. And these mass surveillance systems, I think, were always implemented with the intention to put everyone in that region under such tight gaze, such that they can't really, I think some people described Xinjiang as an open air prison. So obviously the conditions in prison is worse, but outside of it, people are under such tight restrictions that and their spirits have been broken through the Strike Hard campaign, such that the Chinese government is able to impose thorough control on people's thoughts and behaviors. There is also, the fact is that many Uyghurs remain in disappearance or that they have been given long prison sentences. So the crisis remains. The problem is that we have much less ability to monitor what's going on in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is always a closed-off region, but I think given the attention to that region, the Chinese government has also restricted much more the ability for us to look inside the region since the Strike Hard campaign started, and it became much more, the abuses became well known. And also because of COVID restrictions. Now, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights is about to visit the region, as Jim had mentioned at the beginning. This would be the first time a UN High Commissioner on Human Rights has been able to visit China, I think, in over a decade. It's a momentous visit, but at the same time, we fear that this visit would not be conducted with the rigor that it deserves because of the fact that the High Commissioner has, in fact, been delaying the issuance of a report that her own office had prepared on the human rights violations in Xinjiang. And we fear that under the pressure and manipulation of the Chinese government, her visit would not be a genuine one to investigate what's going on in Xinjiang. I fear my time is up, but I would say that the international responses to what is happening in Xinjiang, the gravity of these abuses has been very inadequate. We see the US having responded to it in some ways, primarily in the context of US-China competition, but the responses from every other government, most governments in fact, have been incredibly weak, including from governments that have Muslim majority populations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I want to call out, has essentially done nothing to uphold the right to freedom of religion of the people in Xinjiang. So it's an appalling affront to human rights, and from every single actor involved. And I hope to see some more pressure, particularly from Michelle Bachelet when she finally visits Xinjiang.
Thank you, Maya. Our next speaker is Professor Yen Sun Yen, and she's a professor in political science at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Her research interests include China's domestic and international politics, political corruption, and ethnic politics in China. Professor Sun is the author of a number of books, including most recently, From Empire to Nation State, Ethnic Politics in China, which came out in 2020, which offers a historical political perspective on China's contemporary ethnic conflict. And we found out in speaking in preparation for this event, in communicating with each other, that I'm reviewing this book of hers and she's reviewing the new edition of My Eurasian Crossroads. So we're reviewing each other's books. I don't know if that's a conflict of interest. It means we shouldn't be here. I don't know. In any case, Professor Sun's book is based on extensive field work in the Uyghur region, in Tibet, among Korean populations in Yanbian. And she was asking a lot of very direct questions, really, of scholars, students, cadres, individuals, in society in these areas about sensitive matters of ethnic policy. And today, when it's actually very hard to hear from Chinese scholars themselves, I was in the PRC, about how all of what we've been talking about appears within China, right? I mean, all we really get are blanket denials from foreign ministry spokesmen. It's very hard because of COVID and other things to actually have the kind of conversations which we might have with colleagues and friends to sort of see how they're seeing all this. So because of that situation, Professor Sun's work is I think even more important in that it offers important perspectives on how all this looks, within the CCP system, but also among academics and others there. So I'll now turn this over to Professor Sun. You're muted still. Please unmute, Yen.
Yes. Thank you, Jim, for that nice introduction. I actually reviewed your book before this panel, so there was no conflict of interest for me, on my part at least, right? And I thank you for inviting me as a sort of representing a diverse perspective, because yes, I'm proud to say I'm very familiar with both the Western perspectives and Chinese ones. So today I'm mainly going to report what looks like from inside. So how should the international community respond? I begin with not with Xinjiang, but with Baltimore. I arrived here in the 1980s to attend the Johns Hopkins. Days into my stay, my place was burglarized. Very scary for someone who just arrived knowing nothing about America. Soon I learned about terms like inner cities, Section 8, and welfare policies. I was shocked by those welfare policies.
So Professor Sun said there might be some connection problems. So I actually have a copy of her notes here. And if you do come back in, Professor Sun, just shout out and we'll turn back over to you. But I'm going to continue with your notes right now. Let's see. Yeah, so Professor Sun was shocked by the welfare policies. According to her Chinese values at the time, people should work to keep sharp. So I thought welfare policies must be designed to keep people down. I also thought that back home, the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda about the mistreatment of Black people in America must be true. I'm going to continue to say I, please understand when I say I, this is Professor Sun Yan's voice, okay? If I were politically aware and knew a strong word at the time, I might have even used it. Obviously, I got the policy intentions all wrong. My point is, when it comes to Xinjiang, inland Chinese, so Nadi Chinese, apply their values to judge and treat Uyghurs. American and Western sources, in turn, apply their values to judge and treat China's policies. To effectively address the Uyghur situation, it would help if each side recognizes its own partialities and the importance of social contexts. I do my part here by showing how different Chinese groups see the Xinjiang issue and what is relevant to understand them. First, prominent policy analysts of minority policy in China. There are three contending groups: the liberal autonomists, represented by Professor Ilham Tohti and supporters of Hu Yaobang's minority policies from the 1980s. Socialist autonomists, represented by minority members who occupy positions of power in the Chinese system. And what Professor Sun calls integrationists, represented by Ma Rong, a prominent anthropologist and scholar with close official ties. The three groups correspond roughly to the geographical tiering of China. The core regions inhabited by agrarian Han Chinese. Are you back, Yan? Can you unmute? Can you unmute?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, so I've been reading your notes and
yeah, you do a better job actually than me. So go ahead.
No. I just got to you were reading the different regions, the core.
Yes.
Begin there.
Yeah. So the second tier would be the inner peripheral regions where I'm actually from. They are historically more incorporated. And then thirdly, the outer peripheral regions, China's Eurasia frontiers, historically less incorporated. So Tibet and Xinjiang remain the only two outer regions. So therefore, there are challenges for China's nation building efforts. So these three Chinese groups agree on the socio-economic origins of the Uyghur crisis. One is the disintegration of the Uyghur community due to market reforms since the 1990s. And secondly, the social consequences of this disintegration, erosion of the social and moral fabric of the Uyghur society, rising cultural conservatism, religious fundamentalism, growing hatred of the Han people, especially the migrant competition, and relative impoverishment, crime, and violence. I highlight these factors because China's justification of the so-called re-education centers is to fight terrorism and religious radicalism as state-defined. So it does not help to address the Uyghur crisis if we do not acknowledge the existence of those problems, especially violence, right? That China is fighting terrorism and fundamentalism the wrong way is a different matter. So Even the three Chinese groups disagree on the solutions, let alone, of course, Western and Chinese sources. So for the liberals, they want more decision-making power in the hands of Uyghurs. For integrationists, not surprisingly, more Mandarin education, job training, and assimilation. Less affirmative action because they think affirmative action provides too much protection and actually keep them down. For socialists, more developmental and distributional policy, and yes, affirmative action. So they are willing, the socialists are willing to tolerate sticks for the sake of carrots. Right? So how do they view the re-education centers? China's white paper calls them 教培中心, education and training centers. So liberals now are silenced. So they would definitely oppose them. The other two groups view the state's intentions as good. So even if many unintended consequences exist in reality, right? So to these two groups, the benefits of development outweigh the costs, right? And the trainings, right? And job assignment. But it is possible to get across to these people Western concerns, right? If the issues are framed in terms of the right way and wrong way to fight terrorism and fundamentalism. They understand the illegal excesses, right? And do not approve of them. But if you just threw denunciations and lectures at them, the integrationists in particular get very defensive, right? And the less informed people among the two groups, right, are even more defensive. For them, the US and the West have a credibility problem. So you can fight terrorism by going into other people's countries and destroy their homes, but we cannot fight terrorism our way at home. So they often bring up the fabrication of evidence that Bush Jr. used to justify the Iraqi war. And they tend to think in terms of American conspiracies, whether it is Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or even the war in Ukraine. So the second group I want to talk about in China are the liberal forces. I'm actually in social media with a lot of them. They are the critics of authoritarianism and government abuses, admirers of Western democracy. But even for them, I would describe their attitude, general attitude for Xinjiang as apathy because of a lack of information and also because the Western country or Western sources ethnicize the Xinjiang problem, which does not always resonate with them. So if you characterize the abuses in Xinjiang as patterns that also occur elsewhere in China or structural to the authoritarian system, that would click. For example, in the Chinese system, central authorities usually tell local authorities, here is the outcome I want. How you get there, they care less. So there's a lot of leeway for local abuse, right? Ends justify the means. So I think previously you mentioned, both of you mentioned the Xinjiang abuse is really picked up after 2017. That's exactly after Chen Quanguo, right, took power because the previous party secretary emphasized a policy of benevolence, which of course was regarded as a failure, right? Also, if you describe the birth control policies as the harsh implementation of family planning in Xinjiang, right, as something that Han people suffered also in the earlier decades, even more harshly, that would also click with, I would say, not just liberals, but Chinese people as a whole. So the equalization family planning policy was enacted after Chen Quanguo came to Xinjiang and enforced the next year. But if you describe the abuses in Xinjiang as genocide, I would say even the most fierce critics of the government may not see it that way. Right? In fact, Hong Kong protesters may have made a mistake as well. Liberal forces on the mainland. On the contrary, the beating up of mainland speakers, right, reporters, live on TV was divisive and reinforced the government's portrayal of Hong Kong protesters as thugs. Right. So in educated circles within Xinjiang, I'm referring here to non-minority members, are aware of the abuses, especially the arbitrary sending of people to those centers. They may be critical of blatant discrimination and abuses, but still would not see them as genocide. Does liberal support within China matter? It does, in the sense that it can help galvanize public opinion in ways effective in China. If you need China's understanding or cooperation, right? You need Chinese understanding. For example, the outpouring of critical voices about the chained woman has led to widespread public awareness and some government reactions. So it would be much harder for bride smuggling to be tolerated in the future. The chained woman, in fact, is a minority member from Yunnan province. The third Chinese group I want to talk about are the ordinary Han and other non-Turkic Chinese. So inside Xinjiang, these ordinary people are sick and tired of violent incidents. And I'm very familiar with them because during my trips there, I myself experienced some of them. So they are generally supportive of extreme measures to root out extremists. Of course, they are also sick and tired of the extreme security measures imposed by local authorities. And here they can empathize with ordinary Uyghurs who have it even worse, right? But these ordinary Han Chinese tend to place blame not on authorities, but on the small number of people who committed violence and therefore induced the extreme policies. Outside Xinjiang, ordinary people are generally unaware of the extreme policies and abuses, but many have impressions of violence in and from Xinjiang and dramatic improvements in recent years. So for those who watched the government's documentaries about the atrocities of state-defined terrorism in Xinjiang and the vocational training at the re-education centers, they generally support state policies, but very supportive, I would say. But even for them, if you phrase abuses in terms of the Cultural Revolution, right, family planning policies in the early decades, arbitrary land seizures across China, or nowadays abuses in China, in Shanghai's extreme lockdowns, even ordinary Han Chinese can understand and empathize. Right. Summing up my point, while it is understandable for activists, right, to frame Xinjiang issues in terms that appeal to Western governments and publics, this can backfire in China and cause more misunderstanding and mistrust. So it is relevant at all to make those inside China understand Uyghur and the Western concerns and the urgency of changes. It is important to frame things in ways that appear sensible, factual, and reliable to them. Here I add one example of homestays that previous speakers mentioned. I mean, I have come across plenty of people who have done this homestays, and overwhelmingly they complain them. The people who do the visits complain them as burdensome and empty and just ceremony and no use because they could not communicate in the language. Very burdensome for the families because the Uyghur families are overly warm. They bring up food, bring up fruits, and I actually know my own relatives who have done this. I even went with one of my relatives to before the homestay, but his Uyghur host family. So I would actually, when I raised this issue, for example, at a conference homestay, Ma Dong basically said, can you imagine American government making white family stay with black family, making friends, making kinship, right? Even if it's burdensome, but it does improve inter-ethnic understanding. So here is my, that's what I want to say.
Thank you very much, Yen. There's a lot there for us to think about, and I'm sure we'll be bringing up many things in the question and answers later on. I want to turn this over now to Jeffrey Ngaw. Jeffrey is a writer, a historian, and a pro-democracy activist based in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University. He's a PhD candidate in history. He's my student, adding to our conflicts of interest here on this panel. He's also a policy and research fellow at the Hong Kong Democracy Council. And I say he's my student, but also in the best tradition, I like to feel I'm also his student. So I'll now, we'll turn it over for Jeffrey's remarks. And he's, of course, bringing in a Hong Kong perspective on our talk.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jim, for the kind introduction. It's very good to be here. Thank you to the team at Georgetown for organizing this as well. I would, I think I would start by saying I'll start with the historical stuff, and then I'll transition more to the present. And I'll be saying this, in my dual sort of identity as both a historian and as an activist as well, and hopefully be able to respond to some of the remarks made earlier by other panelists. I would just say at the outset, I think the very fact that someone like me is invited to a panel like this, on Xinjiang, offering a Hong Kong perspective, reflects a very important shift in recent years, both politically and intellectually. As recent as maybe 5-6 years ago, it would be hard to imagine a talk exclusively on Uyghurs, or in Xinjiang would have someone speaking about Hong Kong, just because those issues were seen both by activists and by intellectuals or by academics as more separate than they seem right now, and increasingly these issues show that they're more interconnected. So I think that's a very important point. I would say, though, the frontier challenges faced by the Chinese Communist Party right now, whether it's in East Turkestan or Xinjiang, in inner/Southern Mongolia, in Tibet, they largely are mirrored by some of the issues faced by the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong and Taiwan, Macau, etc. And a lot of this has to go back to the early 20th century, right? When the Qing Empire collapsed, and the Chinese nationalists, after the Republican Revolution, wanted to recreate a nation state based on those territorial boundaries, and that vision being turned into an actuality, right? By the CCP after they came into power in 1949. Most of what had happened in Inner Asia, the reconquest of Inner Asia, occurred in the 1940s and the 1950s. And Taiwan is obviously an ongoing issue across the strait. And then by the 1990s, the control of Hong Kong and Macau as well, through one country, two systems. And because these areas were traditionally frontiers of imperial conflict, there's good reason why control from the center is proving to be more difficult, and hence the crackdown across all these places. Obviously, there's a stronger ethnic and religious element to the case of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, less so in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is much more diverse in terms of people's religious preference, and also Hong Kong is a Han majority territory, unlike in East Turkestan or in Tibet. And because of those differences, I would say even activists, pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, have for decades largely ignored the issue of Tibet and with the Uyghurs. I was thinking about this recently when we Hong Kongers here in Washington, and across the US and around the world, have been organizing against the Beijing Winter Olympics with our Tibetan and Uyghur and Taiwanese friends. Just how much the situation has changed even from 2008 to the present day, where in 2008 was a time when most Hong Kongers were largely proud of the fact that there were Olympic Games, Summer Olympic Games being held in Beijing, and largely were not sympathetic to the Tibetan uprising and the Tibetan concerns as to why the human rights concern as to why those games should not have been held in China. And of course, when reports came around 2009 about, and I'm putting this in quote, violent riots in Urumqi, Hong Kongers largely saw those as religious and ethnic minority conflicts that had nothing to do with Hong Kong. And it really took the failure of the umbrella movement to show that one country, two systems was always a broken promise. And for Hong Kongers to begin to identify with these other causes. And again, even then, the immediate place that Hong Kongers looked to was Taiwan because of cultural, linguistic, etc. Affinities. And so so I think largely what we're seeing right now has to do with the fact that under Xi Jinping, who is about to enter his third term, unprecedented third term since Deng Xiaoping's years, largely how that crackdown has intensified, and a lot of this cross-movement solidarity that we are seeing is the work of activists, but also the fact that the crackdown has just increased so much, and it doesn't make sense to do anything otherwise in terms of responding to those crackdown than to build solidarity with these other movements, and that brings me to what is about to happen in 2 weeks, which is the chief executive, and I put this in quotes again, the election in Hong Kong that is happening on May 8th. So about 2 weeks, as I said. Traditionally, and I think this gets into the factional sort of politics within Hong Kong, but I think this is important. Traditionally, there were 3 ways that the Hong Kong political elite basically gained power. One is by defending business interests. There have been 4 chief executives since the 1997 handover, and the person who embodied this faction would be the first chief executive, C.H. Tung, who basically ran a large shipping company doing business with the world, but also allowing China's rise through the integration into the international capitalist system. The second route is through the civil service, and these are people who entered the civil service during the British colonial years, rose through the ranks over the years, initially trained by the colonial government, but then expressed support for the CCP after 1997. And Carrie Lam, who is about to step down, is an example of that. And the third way is to become powerful in Hong Kong was to be a hardline Chinese communist. And the best person to exemplify that was C.Y. Leung, the chief executive who presided over the city during the 2014 umbrella movement, and who I believe largely made that turn to make Hong Kong a much more repressive place. And I say that, and I mean, I outlined this because the guy who is about to become chief executive, John Lee, belongs neither to any of the 3 traditional routes of obtaining political power in Hong Kong. He was basically a cop. He joined the police force in the British colonial years, rose through the police ranks, and then was taken out of the police force to become secretary for security about 5 years ago. And then again was promoted to the city's number 2 official last year, and now is the only candidate standing in the chief executive selection, so basically selected by a committee of about 1,400 people, handpicked by Beijing. So he's almost certain, 99.9% certain that he will be the chief executive of Hong Kong in the next 5 years. And he is an important figure in our conversation today, because when he became Secretary of Security, I believe in 2018 or 2019, he made a trip to Xinjiang, and that was already when reports were surfacing around the world that there were concentration camps, that the crackdown in Xinjiang had stepped up. He went to the trip. He toured the territory, came back not only denying allegations of human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, or even genocide. That's what you would expect. But in fact, he credited whatever was going on in Xinjiang as a good model for how to take care of Hong Kong's, in his words, basically the trouble in Hong Kong. And so we can expect that in the next 5 years, Hong Kong will move, unfortunately, further into the direction of Xinjiang. And this just goes to show that, at the top of the CCP leadership, frontier issues are all interconnected. And again, it makes sense for academics like us, to think about these issues as historically and currently politically connected, but also as activists to build cross-solidarity movement, because they are seen at the top as being part of the different pieces of part of the same puzzle. And then I will the last thing I'll say is the national security law in 2020 that came into play almost 2 years ago effectively just ended one country, two systems. There's no press freedom, no academic freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech in Hong Kong right now is almost impossible to imagine anytime in the near future that there will be massive protests that were happening and first sort of banned in the name of COVID. But even after the pandemic, is so hard to imagine, mass organization in Hong Kong just because of the political situation. And I would, of course, push back on the idea that the national security law or any repressive measures put in place in Hong Kong were results of supposedly Hong Kong protests turning violent, because there have been a long tradition of peaceful protests in Hong Kong fighting for democracy, and they were never about trying to create an independent nation. It was about making sure that the CCP would live up to its promise after the handover of Hong Kong, that there would be genuine democracy in the election of the chief executive and also the legislature. There were protests in 2003, in 2014 as well. And only in 2019 were protests more confrontational. And that was after decades of broken promises. And I think Macau actually offers the best counterexample to that idea, that crackdown increases only because people rise up, because Macau is a place that has also handed over from the Portuguese Empire to Chinese Communist Party in 1999, also one country, two systems framework. And there have rarely been mass protests, but some of the tactics that we see the CCP uses in Hong Kong to silence the opposition, including, for instance, the disqualification of democratically elected lawmakers, those practices have also been applied in Macau. And no one can reasonably say that that's because there have been any kind of mass protests or people trying to fight for independence or anything like that in Macau. So I would say that it makes far more sense to think of these frontier territories each as a laboratory of repression, and these tactics get recycled, and we can imagine more digital surveillance, or even more disturbing policies. I don't want to say that they're imminent, but I don't think they're impossible, that have been applied in Xinjiang or East Turkestan, that will soon be introduced in Hong Kong in the next 5 years or in a longer period. So these are again laboratories of repression, and it only makes sense for us to talk about these places together if we are to understand what's going on in Xinjiang or in Tibet or in Hong Kong, in Macau, and hopefully not in Taiwan, but again, from the perspective of the CCP, these issues are all connected.
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey, for reminding us of these connections between Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong regions, which interestingly, all have this word autonomous or autonomy in their formal names. And as different as they are, in many ways, we do see sort of convergences of those issues going on now. One of the questions in the Q&A brings up the issue of Uyghurs outside of China being refouled back or threatened to be repatriated back to China. There's a few cases that are pending right now, and many people trying to avoid this from certain places. Let me actually direct a question, if I can, to Maya about that, because it's related to. I wanted to follow up a little bit on her comments, in particular about the inadequacy of the international response to what's going on. And I wondered, Maya, if you wanted to talk a little bit, maybe suggest some more things that should be done by countries internationally? And then also, if you could speak particularly about this issue of these forced extraditions that seem to be happening here and there, and what the United States or other places could do.
Thank you. Well, thank you for bringing up the issue of extradition. I believe it's Sadia. I don't know if I pronounce his or her name here. The violations against Uyghurs are so numerous, sometimes you fail to mention some of them. Here is the Chinese government essentially hunting for Uyghurs from abroad with the cooperation of governments from Saudi Arabia to Egypt. Some of these governments themselves are self-proclaimed defender of Islam. So the abuses against Uyghurs is pretty global. And the forced return of people to a place where they can be subjected to torture is against international human rights law. So what we see here is not just a lack of response, is some of the government's active collaboration with the Chinese government in abusing Uyghur people's rights. And I think that itself is a sign and illustration of just how far human rights globally has deteriorated. And I think that same question also asks what we can do about this. And as someone who's worked in China for such a long time, it's the kind of answers or questions that should have been asked many years ago. And of course, groups like us have been asking that question so many years. And always, the more we say we should be holding Chinese government accountable for abuses, many governments, I think for many years, just looked the other way because, China was a big market. They want to make money in China, both companies and governments. And the expectations, I think, is that the Chinese government feels it could just act with impunity and never have to be held accountable. And that created further and further abuses now going into, including places like Hong Kong. So the short and more compact answer to this is that, or the official answer of human rights groups would be that we want to see, for example, that governments push at the UN Human Rights Council to set up a commission of inquiry into Xinjiang's abuses, bringing the whole issue back into a multilateral platform where we have standards, some of which the Chinese government itself has subscribed to, and that we will evaluate those standards and evidence and there, instead of being adjudicated in kind of like the US-China competition frame, which is essentially a bilateral situation where the US is also at fault itself of many violations, both domestically and internationally. So that would be the short answer. The long answer is also just going back to what I was saying, is that I think the years of neoliberalism that essentially give a free pass to businesses across nations, that enable businesses in places which has severe human rights abuses, that it is okay to import large amounts or depend on oil from Russia, regardless of just how the human rights situation there is, that we would be importing, depending on medical supplies and many other products from China, even though the whole country does not allow labor unions. That was somehow widely accepted as an international practice. These fundamentals have led to essentially a monster that is eating up a place like Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but also, the rest of China. And that those fundamentals have to be re-evaluated. I think that rethinking may have started with the war in Ukraine, but I think certainly the role of Western governments in creating the situation, I think, remain unexamined.
Thank you, Maya. And just a note to the audience, if you do have questions, we have one or two queued up, but we will have time, I think, for quite a lot more if you want to put them up there. A member of the audience has asked, I believe this is a question for Professor Sun, that outside of the intellectual and academic sphere, how well known is the situation in Xinjiang amongst the general Chinese population? And you did, I think you touched on that, but please do maybe tell us a little bit more, and maybe talk a little bit more about social media discussion of these kinds of things. I think so. My impression from reading about Chinese social media, mainly, which is what I do, is that the word Xinjiang itself is practically banned, and it will get taken down from Weibo as soon as it gets put up. So perhaps you can give us a little more understanding and nuance about broader popular discussions or understanding of the issue. And then if I could just add on one aspect to that question for you, Professor Sun. I was very interested by your comparisons or your contextualization in terms of ethnic relations and race relations in the United States. And this is something I've been thinking about too. And I'm wondering if in broader or academic circles in China, are those kind of comparisons also common? Is this something that you're thinking of yourself, or is it something one might see in the discourse in China, either as a kind of whataboutism, as you mentioned, or as, for example, way back when, Ma Rong actually famously evoked the idea, I think it was Ma Rong, famously evoked the idea of the melting pot from American tradition, which is a complex and problematic concept here, but in a way that started some of this discussion there. So the way in which our conversations in the United States and in China about race and ethnic relations, they are kind of dancing around each other in interesting ways. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
The first question about the general public outside Xinjiang, right? Their knowledge of Xinjiang's situation, I would almost say literally probably nothing. I think Xinjiang, the words can come up in Chinese social media and websites and so on and so forth. And even re-education centers, these words appear. Of course, they are usually positive about those centers, and people do leave a lot of comments. But readers who leave comments, I usually see they are people from Xinjiang. They are in internal China, but they leave comments there. So it's not the general population outside Xinjiang who are leaving comments. So the general population outside Xinjiang usually has very limited, but rather probably biased, right, experiences with Uyghurs. Usually it's migrants. So usually they don't realize, I mean, you cannot blame them either. They usually don't realize that when Uyghurs migrants in inland China, it's like almost a foreign country for them in terms of language, culture, ways of socializing. I think immigration studies scholars tell us that immigration patterns usually impact by social networks where your families already are, right? But those Uyghurs have very little of that inside China. So once they move inside China, it's very hard for them to apply for licenses, to make friends, to even have people help them. So very often at the beginning, they become what Chinese public perceives as petty thieves, criminals. So that I would say that stigmatization has stayed in people's minds. So if, as soon as you mention Uyghurs, it's that kind of impression. So it's very hard to regain, I would say, the trust. It's very hard because China is a very homogeneous country in inland China. Because I have been a minority in America, so I can see both ways. But for most Chinese, they don't see that way. So they see everybody as the same. So they don't see their particular difficulties. So if you talk about crackdowns in Xinjiang, of course, those criminals. So this is so it's very hard, I would say, to get public sympathies. And for comparisons between the racial situation in America and China, Ma Rong originally, because he studied in America at Ivy League, right, is very positive about racial relations in America, precisely because he was ivory tower, Ivy campus, melting pot, intermarriages, people getting along. So he wanted that for China too. But China's population, ethnic population, especially Uyghurs and Tibetans, are concentrated in their homeland. But he wanted them to be equal citizens, to have opportunities everywhere. He thinks it's wonderful for them. If they are stuck in one place, it's not good for their personal development. With probably not enough appreciation for their, by the way, Ma Dong himself is a minority, but because he was born and raised in Beijing, and Beijing people in general have very little appreciation for dialogues. I was not from Beijing, so I could speak several dialogues. I can appreciate local dialogue, but someone from Beijing, they want to push Mandarin everywhere. So I would say for Uyghurs in China, inland China today, it's still very hard for them to get housing. Landlords usually do not want to rent it to them. Also because of cultural differences, right? When I interview someone about this, he said, they say, one person is renting, but then they bring 10 people. And if I complain, they fight with me. So they have that kind of impression. But more recently, I would say there have been far more TV reports of racial relations in America, biased too, because they don't really understand relations. For example, the report COVID deaths as more in the poor communities. Vaccination rates are lower in those communities, and no grocery stores in those communities. Because I'm from New York, I know why there are no grocery stores in the inner cities, but TV stations, they don't know here. So they give the impression of that kind of wonderful things in China's ethnic regions. But there are also a few scholars who do know the situation in America. They would say actually the Tiger Mom approach in Xinjiang and Tibet is actually not at all bad compared with the do nothing approach in America, in terms of do nothing about inner cities, homelessness, and Chinese TV show a lot of homelessness. The tents erecting up in Los Angeles, across California, and idle people, right? Because of universal income, this debate. This is shocking to Chinese people, right? How can you just give people free money? People have to work, right? So this is their basic values. So this is so in comparison, they feel the Chinese approach of uplifting people out of poverty, of doing something for them, right? Proactively giving them jobs, transferring them to places with jobs, is actually more positive. Because otherwise, there are few people who know about this. The crime rates for poor communities are also very high. And if they end up in prison, especially private prison, it's not necessarily much better. But of course, they mainly criticize this as a matter of hypocrisy, credibility problems. I don't know if I have answered the question, but that's how I feel.
No, thank you. Thank you, Yan. Well, let me now go to Tim, and then I'm going to go to Jeffrey after that. Tim, I wondered if you had some general comments or responses. Yan in particular has given us a lot to think about in these broad comparisons between the US and China. And I don't want to lay all this on you, but I think that there's some issues about how people in China understand what's going on in Xinjiang and elsewhere. But also and how the international community and how US leaders maybe message about it. And I'm curious, since you're someone who's been, very involved in gathering information and like me, running around giving lots of talks, messaging exactly about it. So I'm curious what you think about some of her comments. But then also there's a question here in the listing about comparing Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and to what extent does religion matter there? So that would be the second question, which I'd like you to address, perhaps Tim too, but then we'll go to Jeffrey after that. If those aren't too complicated a set of instructions. To you now, Tim.
It's a great question. The first one, in terms of recognizing, I think there are certainly policy similarities between what's going on in, racially in the U.S. And then the Xinjiang crisis and the CCP's, treatment of Uyghurs, and of course the official framing of poverty alleviation and the eradication of extremism. I often wonder, and one of the comparisons that I most regularly and most comfortably draw upon in the US is not about contemporary race relations, but more of the US government's treatment of Native peoples. Because I think what's missing in comparisons between, for example, African Americans and white relations, and then governments trying to handle the tensions, and tensions seem to be increasing, especially with Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of that, is that it misses the connections to the homeland, and I think that connection is critical for understanding responses that Uyghurs have and Tibetans have to policies that they view as repressive. And I think that if we, you draw comparisons to the US treatments of Native Americans, the removal of Native Americans from their land, the creation and maintenance of boarding schools, which of course in contemporary China, there are national level boarding schools for both Tibetans and Uyghurs. And for Uyghurs, they actually predate the kind of the boarding schools that have been constructed specifically for children whose parents have been detained. That we see, I think, clearer similarities between the two. And then again, it makes us, have to be aware that, that these policies are being, regardless of what the official framings are, quite ironically, the U.S. also framed its rationalized Native American boarding schools as in a sense poverty relief, that they were going to provide skills and training that was going to allow Native Americans to become contributing members of America. And so, again, we see the repetition of this language now nearly 100 years away. But I think that these attachments to homeland are important, and it provides a somewhat different scenario than contemporary U.S. racial relations. Now, in terms of the second question in Hong Kong and the ways that religion plays a role, or maybe not, I've argued that it does, and I'm not as familiar with the Hong Kong situation, but there seems to be, I think, an added degree of suspicion amongst the Chinese Communist Party when you have that fusion that I alluded to above of whether it's nationalism or at least a political activism, but nationalism calls for autonomy, and it's fused with religion. That sometimes it can fuel these movements in ways that a completely quote unquote secular political movements may not. And I do think that complicates the matter in Xinjiang. And what I mean, it complicates it. It's justified, at least in terms of how the party sees it, even harsher responses, because it's not just calls for political, for more, political autonomy, but that these calls have been, they've been strengthened by this kind of these underpinnings in maybe religious sensibilities that may not be as present in Hong Kong. But again, not as familiar with the movements in Hong Kong. I think Jeffrey would be a lot more credible and qualified to comment on those.
Yeah, for sure. I'll answer that question, and then I'll circle back to some of the points relating to the U.S. as well, just so I can also help respond to earlier questions. I think the religious angle does matter in Hong Kong, but obviously not to the extent that it does in East Turkestan or in Tibet. I remember when I was a child growing up in Hong Kong, this probably was either in the late 90s or the early 2000s. One of the earliest tests of one country, two systems after the 1997 handover was the question of whether Falun Gong practitioners from mainland China could enter Hong Kong, because that was after the crackdown by Jiang Zemin on the popular religion in China mainland itself. And at the time, it was a big deal in Hong Kong. And from what I recall, those folks were allowed in, and there have been some Falun Gong presence over the decades in Hong Kong. Now is a very different story right now, and I think to express sort of political opposition to the government with the religious flavor to it is going to get most people in further trouble. But I would say though, it's not perfect. The religious community is not perfectly aligned with the political causes, and I say that meaning it's not as if the Catholic community or the Christian community or whoever are unified in any kind of way with one set of political beliefs. So Joseph Zen, the cardinal of the Catholic Church, very famous cardinal of the Catholic Church in the 2000s, I think he retired in 2009, but he has since been, he's in his 80s right now, but he's been one of the most strongly anti-CCP figures in Hong Kong. But that, he's obviously an inspiration to many Catholics in Hong Kong and also non-Catholics, but that is not an indication that the Catholic community in Hong Kong is unified against the government. It's the same story with Christian churches. There are churches that are pro-government. There are also churches that have been very vocal in their support of the 2019 protests. In fact, one of them had their HSBC bank account frozen because the government accuses it of money laundering, which is a common tactic that the government now uses, basically using the power of banking institutions in Hong Kong to crack down on sources of funding for protesters. And so I think again, that the religious angle certainly matters, and there are ways that religious practitioners interpret their faith in expressing their political positions, but that can go either way. There are also folks who are very pro-government. So it just speaks to the diversity, I would say, of Hong Kong as a society, multicultural, multiracial society, and how different sort of players are interacting with the protest movement. And Jim, I know because you have also been thinking a lot about the racial ethnic issues, as you said, both relating to China and in the US. So I think I can speak a little about that as well. And also what the first question as to what can be done in the US about the issue in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. So part of what the good thing that came out of the anti-Beijing Olympic movement was really, as I said, this cross movement solidarity that we've managed to build. And right now, what we actually have been doing as activists in DC is to advocate for retaining the Hong Kong and Uyghur immigration provisions in the America Competes Act in Congress, because they're going through a conference committee process right now. The House bill, which I think is more progressive, includes those immigration provisions that have been stripped away in the Senate bill. And in the past 2-3 weeks or so, I and my Hong Kong colleagues have joined forces with folks at the Uyghur Human Rights Project and the Uyghur American Association, talking to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, asking them to retain those immigration provisions as they reconcile the two versions of the bill. And that is one way I think the US and other countries around the world can easily support Uyghurs and Hong Kongers who need to flee and who need safety and who cannot safely return back to our homes. And so I think that is a very realistic thing to do at, I would argue, a relatively low cost to host countries, because the number isn't huge anyway. And so I'm obviously quite disappointed by some of the pushback that I've been hearing. And that pushback, by the way, is also entwined in the racial politics of America. And I think this is where it gets interesting, because there are obviously folks in general who are anti-immigration, and a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric is deeply entwined with white supremacist arguments or the white supremacist tradition in the US. But I don't just mean like fringe far-right figures. Those people obviously are opposed to our cause. But I would, based on my observation, I would argue that white supremacy is institutionalized in the whole US immigration system. And we know, like, even mainstream liberals are more sympathetic, say, to the Ukrainians. You know, the Biden administration is accepting 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the US, which is obviously great. I mean, they need that help. But then, you know, Afghans are wondering, well, what about us? You know, and of course, Hong Kongers and Uyghurs, you know, are right to ask the same question, like, you know, who gets to decide who deserve to be saved, and you know, and who does not. And then you have certain people on the left, less so on the issue of immigration per se. But again, this is not, you know, I'm not saying that everybody is saying this, but there are influential people arguing that being tough on China in general inflames anti-AAPI violence. And there's a very Americanized way of understanding racial issue. And I would say that that reflects a failure to separate the CCP from the Chinese people when they say that. But we know that there's also pushback against some of the China policies that we support and we think will improve human rights situation in China by people who invoke racial tensions here in the United States. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and obviously there's not time for that today, but I just bring these up to show how ethnic and racial issues in China, you know, how that conversation can become a part of the conversation about racial issues in the US, and different people interpret things very differently and use terms, the same terms, but mean very different things just because the context is so different. And I think more conversation needs to happen, honest conversations need to happen about those issues.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I would love to see an outpouring of outrage on PRC social media about how Hong Kongers and Uyghurs are being discriminated against in their efforts to immigrate and asylum in the US vis-a-vis white Ukrainians. This would be a very interesting kind of jujitsu. But I can actually see how, in a way, there might be many, you know, there might be a sort of sympathy about that. We only have a couple of minutes left. There's one question in the queue about how effective re-education in Xinjiang has been or is. That's a complicated and big question for 3 minutes, but I wonder if you could just, if we all have last words either about that or where things are going from here, or if each of you have just a quick final comment, we can just go around. And why don't we start with Maya? Sure.
I think it depends, of course, on what is considered a success. From the Chinese government's point of view, they may think that short-term stability is very important, and locking up probably 1 million people out of your 12 million ethnic minorities and then subjecting the rest of them to pervasive surveillance for long periods of time could be considered very much a success, because if we all are in prison, there's nothing we can do, either overthrowing the regime or just protesting out on the streets. All of that would be defined as a success, right? On the other hand, if we are talking about a long-term affinity or nation building even, in which one group of minority feels they really belong, I think the ethnic policies in China, in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang are a resounding failure. This is going to reverberate on Chinese politics and society for so many years to come. Uyghurs who might have in the past expected Chinese law to protect them, I think no longer believe so. And to feel that way, I think is a very big change in all of these minority regions.
Yan?
Yeah, I would quote a high-ranking minority official I talked to about development, the benefits versus cost. He says he agrees with the developmental priority because if not, it's ignorance. Anyway, with development, empowerment, people would have more choices, and then things will get better. So in terms of whether the job program is successful, I see that they have been more successful with Uyghur women than young males. But we do see young male problem, not just in Xinjiang, but young male problem in America, Trump supporters, Midwest, young male problem in the inner cities, young male problem in the Middle Eastern countries. So that seems to be a universal problem.
Thank you. Yeah. Tim?
Yeah, I would certainly say that the Chinese Communist Party believes that the camps have been effective, and I think they measure success in terms of social stability and a very kind of superficial social stability, and that is the absence of violence, and they can certainly point to 6 years without any violent incidents as a reflection of that success. But I think if you're looking in the long term, what they've done is sowed seeds of discontent, and they may be planted deeply, but I think it's a matter of time before they sprout, and then there will be, I think, even more complicated and even deeper discontent in the future because of these policies.
And I know it's dangerous ever to try to give Jeffrey the last word, but that's how it's worked out. So.
Well, I think my last word is that China is an empire pretending to be a nation state. And you know, at the onset of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I recall he made that speech, you know, that offered a very dubious interpretation of Ukrainian history, essentially saying that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent sovereign nation, and therefore it warranted a full-scale military invasion. And of course, that invasion is still ongoing. I think that's essentially the same way the CCP sees China as a nation state today, which is basically that other places that it claims has no right to exist otherwise. You know, the only way that they could be is to be a part of the PRC state, and I think the correct framework for us, you know, as academics to think about it is to pull all these frontier issues together and see that they are so interconnected, whether in terms of the contemporary politics of it or the historical roots to the problems that we face today. And I would hope that more conversations like the one that we're having this morning here can happen moving forward in the public space, because I think that's crucially important. So I thank everybody for taking the time and, you know, and doing this.
Well, great. And I thank you all as well. This has really been a wonderful panel. It's given me a lot to think about after having done many such panels over the last couple of years, and yet I have, you know, new thoughts to pursue on this. And I want to thank the Georgetown US-China Dialogue and the Asian Studies Program for sponsoring this event, and encourage our participants to log in and sign up for other events that those units are putting on. And since we've reached the end of our time then, this is the end of the panel. But again, thank you for your participation. And this has been recorded, so if you want to watch it again, or if you know of others who would like to see it, it will be available.